Okay, next is the Austral realm, which is essentially the two countries, Australia and New Zealand. A fairly small realm. It's a fairly short chapter, and lies essentially south of Indonesia. And if you look at where it is south, it's about as far south as North Africa is north. So part of Australia is kind of dry, fairly dry like North Africa is, and also the country of New Zealand. There's less concepts, ideas, and terms, but make sure you know them, even though we're not going to cover them all. So here is a map showing the country of Australia and the second one of New Zealand, which is actually farther away along, farther off the coast. So we kind of put a little box here. And this is also showing elevation. And one thing, Australia is relatively flat compared to New Zealand. New Zealand is like Japan, it is on the Pacific Ring of Fire, very volcanic, lots of volcanoes, earthquakes, and also a mountainous landscape, where Australia is relatively flat. This is a size comparison of Australia and New Zealand with the United States. One thing to note is Australia is big. In fact, it's comparable in size to the continental United States in terms of its size. However, a lot of the land in Australia is desert. So this is showing the desert climate. In yellow, the tan part is semi-arid climate, still fairly dry. You get a little bit of Mediterranean climates like California in the south. And it can be fairly wet down here on the east side. But when you get outside of this east side, you're in the outback, which can be relatively dry. Now, New Zealand, on the other hand, is a relatively wet country. It's a bit further south. It has more contact with the ocean and is wetter than most of Australia. And the vegetation reflects that as well. You have a lot of desert in the interior here, but you also have more kind of wetter environments on the east coast and in New Zealand. And pictures probably express this better, that this is what Australia looks like in the interior. So fairly dry, fairly flat. By comparison, New Zealand, on the other hand, looks more like this. It's very mountainous, very green. So two very different types of landscapes, this in Australia and this in New Zealand. When it comes to agriculture, grazing is important for both Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand, I think it's said they have more sheep than people because of the amount of sheep grazing that's done in New Zealand in the kind of chilly mountainous landscape, and a lot of cattle grazing is done in Australia. But you also have commercial farming, and commercial farming in this part of the world is a lot like in California. It's commercial, not subsistence, and it's a fairly productive area, especially in these wetter parts of Australia. And this is also where the people live. So this eastern part that's wetter, not that many people in Australia because of its dry interior. Also not that many people in New Zealand because of its mountainous interior, but in certain parts of it, it can be fairly densely populated. This is the capital, Sydney here, and Sydney has about a quarter of the population of Australia live in this urban area alone. So it's fairly urbanized. Most people live in cities. In fact, over a fifth of them live in the capital city of Sydney. So maybe just to try to give some comparisons here, that Australia is similar in physical size to the United States, at least without Alaska, but its population is 23 million people, or less than 10% of the US population. So it is an area the size of the United States with a population smaller than California. New Zealand, on the other hand, has, well, not exactly the size of California. It's actually smaller than California, but if we kind of look at them here, that's somewhat comparable in size. However, New Zealand has 4 million people, where California has about 36 million. So it's about just over 10% of the population. So these are rough comparisons, but Australia is like the United States with 10% of its people. New Zealand is like California, but with 10% of its people. There are native peoples in both Australia and New Zealand, but there are differences in when they arrived and also the relative size of the population. In Australia, you have their Aboriginal people, and they arrived tens of thousands of years ago. This is one of the most ancient and most mysterious migrations of people from Africa into other parts of the world. So this is one of the earliest human migrations, was from Africa to places like Australia and other places like Indonesia. So through there, people arrived during the ice ages and kind of became isolated. That at the time, when sea levels were lower, it was easy to get there. We're going to actually include some video about this journey, but over time, they were isolated in Australia, but they continued to live there. One thing about them is they make up a very small percentage of the overall Australian population, only about 3%. New Zealand has indigenous people as well, but they arrived much later. They arrived about 1,000 years ago with the migrations of Polynesians, like the people who migrated to islands like Hawaii. And these migrations included migrations to New Zealand. These are called the Maori people. So the Maori people arrived much more recently in New Zealand than the Aboriginal people came to Australia. One other difference is that they're a larger minority, that they make up about 13% of New Zealand's population. Because of that, they have more political power in New Zealand than the Aboriginal people have in Australia. So this is a figure showing languages and settlement routes in the Pacific, and these dashed lines represent the migrations of tens of thousands of years ago into Australia, whereas these migrations are by boat to the different islands like Hawaii, but also back to New Zealand. And this happened fairly recently. This happened about 1,000 years ago. Now, Australia and New Zealand were both colonies, British colonies for a long period of time. And it's a so Australia, let's kind of focus on Australia, that most of the immigrants came from Europe originally. It was a British colony, and they had policies that excluded non-Europeans from Australia for many years, up until the 1970s, that they had white-only policies that encouraged migration from the British Isles and other parts of Europe, but excluded people from countries nearby like Asia. But since the 1970s, that's changed dramatically, that now Australia is being more integrated with Asia, both economically, but also culturally, because of larger migrations of people from Asia. So from all parts, East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And Australia, more than the United States, is really a country of immigrants. About a quarter of the population of Australia is foreign-born. And just to compare, it's about 10% of the population of the United States. This is showing some of the natural resources. One thing about New Zealand is it's fairly rich in iron and some other natural resources. And so if you compare it, say, to Singapore Island, that it's kind of the mirror opposite. It's a large place with a lot of natural resources, but a fairly small population. New Zealand has a lot of, it's more forested. There are lands that are used for grazing, but it's not really resource rich as much as Australia, but there are some, forest and grazing lands as well.